Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. We're listener-supported independent media. Pitch in if you can, patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Also like, share, subscribe on YouTube, youtube.com/aroundtheempire. Matt Stoller joins us today, and in this episode we discuss an excerpt of Matt's new book titled Goliath, the 100-Year War Between Monopoly Power and Democracy. Here are two paragraphs from the book's abstract. Quote, in Goliath, Matt Stoller explains how authoritarianism and populism have returned to American politics for the first time in 80 years, as the outcome of the 2016 election shook our faith in democratic institutions. It has brought to the fore dangerous forces that many modern Americans never even knew existed. Today's bitter recriminations and panic represent more than just fear of the future. They reflect a basic confusion about what's happening and the historical backstory that brought us to this moment. The true effects of populism, a shrinking middle class, and concentrated financial wealth are only just beginning to manifest themselves under the current administrations. The lessons of Stoller's study will only grow more relevant as time passes. Building upon his viral article in The Atlantic, How Democrats Killed Their Populist Soul, Stoller illustrates in rich detail how we arrived at this tenuous moment and the steps we must take to create a new democracy, unquote. Matt Stoller is a fellow at the Open Markets Institute. He worked for both the House and the Senate as an advisor, and he's written for the New York Times, Washington Post, The New Republic, Vice, Salon, and he was a producer for MSNBC's Dylan Ratigan show. We recorded this on October 28th, 2019. Matt Stoller's here with us. Welcome to Around the Empire, Matt. It's great to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
So just take a couple of minutes to, it's the first time you're on this podcast, so just let the audience know a little bit about you.
Yeah, so I just finished a book called Goliath, the 100-Year War Between Monopoly Power and Democracy, which is a history of the relationship between the American people and corporate power, kind of a hidden history because it's something that most of us don't know anything about. And the reason I wrote it is because I was a staffer working in Congress during the financial crisis. I was working for a Democratic member, and I wanted to know why we screwed everything up, why we bailed out the banks, didn't arrest any executives, and presided over a foreclosure crisis. And it wasn't because the people in charge were corrupt. I don't think Obama was taking payoffs or Geithner or any of them. I think that they fundamentally had an ideological opposition to more democratic forms of organizing economic power. But I came to that after learning about the one person who sort of knew what was happening during the crisis, who was like, oh, that market's going to blow up, and I'd go over and it would blow up. And then she'd say something else and it would happen. And none of the lobbyists or the bankers, nobody knew what was going on except for her. It was this woman named Jane DeRista who had worked for this. I was like, where did you learn all this stuff? And she said, oh, I worked for this guy who ran the banking committee in the 60s and 70s, this congressman named Wright Patman. And then I learned later on that Wright Patman had fought against chain stores in the 1920s and 30s. And it was the removal of a law that he authored called the Robinson-Patman Act, which allowed Walmart to explode in the 70s. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. I've never heard of this guy. And so I did a bunch of research and figured out that there was this whole tradition of opposing concentrated financial power and monopoly power that, among many others, Wright Patman had been a part of, and that tradition was airbrushed out of the history that I had learned. And so in 2008, in 2009, 2010, when we were facing this crisis, most of us were unequipped to see what looked like a technical banking crisis as the political crisis that in fact was. And so we were unequipped to actually understand what we needed to do to restore democracy. So I spent about, 3 to 5 years or so researching and writing. Goliath is the result. It's a description of the stories, the fights over corporate power that took place in the 20th century. It's about why we are in a crisis of monopoly, which you can see in everything from Google and search and Facebook and social and our cable companies and airlines, but also in small markets like peanut butter or syringes or missiles and munitions. You see monopolies everywhere, and these are creating the inequality, income, wage inequality, wealth inequality, regional inequality. They corrupt our society and our politics. They reduce business formation. They reduce productivity. And you're seeing this is a real crisis. And it's not just American capitalism. This is not just how it works. We have had this problem before. We've had robber barons before, and we fought them and won in the first half of the 20th century. And then in the 1970s, we decided to allow them to come back. And this was something that both the right and the left, and it was equally culpable, they made this philosophical decision that we're not citizens, but we are consumers. And concentrated financial power can bring us more stuff cheaper. And you roll that philosophy forward 40 years, you put that in our laws, you put that in our regulations, and what you get is you get a society that's dominated by too big to fail banks, by big tech, by Monsanto, by Walmart, and so on and so forth. But really understanding that these were philosophical and political battles that brought us the world that we live in today. It's a way of empowering us to see that this is only one particular way that we have to structure our culture, and there are other ways.
Right. And I just want to interject here that, while you were focused on those things, I became interested in and focused on empire. And, obviously that's the focus of this podcast, and kind of how all that happened, because I was baffled by it too. And, I lived through particularly the 90s thing that you focus on in the excerpt of your book in this article on Vice that we're, zooming in on today. But, your book and this article definitely tells part of that story. Plus, my background, my family background, generations of Democrats, unions, I have a particular interest in what you have to say. But the main point I want to make is that this, like you said, this same kind of concentration happened in not only did it happen in the military industrial complex, but just the fact that all of these monopolies or clusters of companies, as you call them, formed, it gave, a relatively small number of companies an outsized amount of power. And I would argue that it gave them the power to influence our foreign policy and war decisions too, which contributed to this, the transformation of the American empire. So I got that part out of it too. Yeah.
The most obvious thing that it did in terms of structuring our global society is it opened up the door to an expansionist sort of Chinese autocratic state, which is now extending its power all over the world, including in the United States. And it's the Chinese are doing that. The Chinese Communist Party is doing it through our own corporations. And because we've concentrated our corporations, both, the defense, that's when 90s is when Lockheed became and Martin Marietta. It's when they became Lockheed Martin. It's when Boeing bought McDonnell Douglas. It's, but it's also when you saw the Telecom Act of 96 exploded, media monopolies and laid the foundation for Silicon Valley. And now what China is doing, we began our offshoring to China, and then China became quite powerful using the channels that we set up, that Wall Street set up. And now China we thought we were exporting democracy to China, or at least that's what sort of the policymakers said that we were doing. And then, but it turns out we were importing autocracy from China, and we're in a very dangerous situation because of that.
Yeah, I agree. So the excerpt of this book, I'm not sure which chapter it is, but it and everybody, there'll be links to all this stuff in the show notes so you can read it. You focus in on the 90s, really, and the Clinton administration. And, I was an adult at this point, and I didn't even quite realize what was happening. But I was in the IT industry, and that was one of the earliest ones to start outsourcing and offshoring, every combination of driving down the cost of labor, because they saw the demand was, they realized that IT people were going to have to pay them a lot. And, frankly, we thought we had pretty good job security. Little did we realize what would happen. They'd practically wipe out the whole field in certain ways. But you also talk about, well, let's just start with, you talk about the Dow Jones and what was happening with that. Now, what else I was going to say, just, to let you know, I was in the IT industry, but I had moved over from from a manufacturing focused thing because my background's in engineering and manufacturing engineering. So it was pretty clear that that field was going down. So through sort of serendipity, I ended up in IT in the Wall Street arena. So I was in and around the Wall Street arena during the 90s when all this was happening. And it was definitely like, for example, we provide the first company I worked for, we provided data to all the brokerage terminals and the brokerage terminals themselves. And, we had to do things like we had to redesign our whole system because the Dow Jones index itself had just exploded, and things like that. So there were all kinds. Plus, I noticed a lot of, we started getting into a lot of things in London. We were bringing in research companies from London. So, I did see this happening, but I had no idea of the scale of it. But so you start talking about 1985 when the Dow Jones, jumped, almost 30%. Why don't we start there and talk about
Well,
this
Lenny,
aspect of
can
it?
I just set the stage because you're
Oh,
talking about a
sure.
specific chapter, right? So you're talking about actually it's sort of the end of the book. It's a chapter. Let me see what I'm going to look up the chapter name. The book right here. So it's the Morgans, the Mellons, and the Milkins, right? Or maybe it's Tech Goliaths and Too Big to Fail. That might be the one. Anyway, it's one of the last chapters, and uh, what really has happened at this point in the book is that you've seen the conquest of the robber barons, right? Which Democrats, populists in the 1930s understood that the robber barons were similar in a lot of ways to the people that financed the rise of fascists in other countries, and they would do that in the United States if we didn't figure out a way of undermining their political and economic power. And that's what the New Deal was about. And then in the 1950s, a couple people on the left and the right. On the left, it was John Kenneth Galbraith and Richard Hofstadter, great economist and historian. Then on the right, it was Aaron Director and Milton Friedman and Robert Bork and a few others, created this alternative history of America. And that alternative history, there were no fights over economic power. In fact, there was just a kind of a sort of series of misunderstandings that were related to the Anglo-Saxon crisis of identity, or so-called
Really?
status anxiety. Um, and this, the populist farmers in the 1880s and 90s, they were not fighting against the railroads or the money trust. None of that was real. That was all just a paranoid conspiracy theory from some cranks. That's what the new historians sort of taught. And these were just WASPs that were upset that there were immigrants, right? They were engaged. There was a status anxiety problem. In fact, economic power had never really been a problem in the United States. Americans had always been capitalists. And some of the people that wrote this history were socialists. They didn't like it, but they just said, America's always been this, these racist, crank small business people. It's just been this cynical contest between the small and the big, but they both want the same thing. And in rewriting this history and getting rid of the battles between farmers and small business people and concentrated power, autocracy versus democratic ways of doing business, they changed how an entire generation, the baby boom generation, thought about and understood the world. And so in the 1970s, when this generation came into power, and they came in a series of elections. The first one was in 1974, but then there was another one in 76, and then on the right it was 78. And you saw this kind of class of Watergate babies, and then the new right get into power, and they didn't understand the problem of corporate concentration. They had grown up in an era where it was the Pentagon that was the issue, or it was environmentalism that was the issue, and corporations and banks did not seem threatening. They did not seem particularly important. They seemed like neutral technocratic institutions. The problem was the institutions that were sending their friends to an immoral war halfway around the world in the jungle. And so there was a very sort of libertarian or left libertarian framework, and the consumer rights movement really underpinned a lot of how Democrats thought. And the consumer rights movement was a kind of quasi-socialist enterprise who thought that business didn't matter. How we did business, how we did production doesn't matter. What matters is just consumerism, consumer rights. And so in the 1980s, right, these guys have their battles. They win the Democratic Party mindset in the 1970s. Jimmy Carter is a kind of consumer populist president. He's very influenced by Ralph Nader. He goes after labor very aggressively. He deregulates all of this because of the this alliance between Ralph Nader and the big business world, deregulation of trucking, deregulation of railroads, airlines, banking. That stuff is pushed by the left and the right. And the anti-monopolists, they get rid of Wright Patman, who's one of the main characters in my book in 1975. They dethrone him. He's an old populist. They get rid of him off the banking committee chair because banks don't matter anymore. He's just a crank saying that we have this problem with banks and monopolies. What a loser. That was kind of this new vibe, right?
Uh-huh.
Now then you have a bunch of crises in the 1970s. Banking bankruptcies. You have the bankruptcy of New York City. You have this inflation. You have like, it's kind of New York, it's a series of rolling crises, and there are no more populists there to explain that the problem is financial power has gone wild and corporations are too big, right? It's not a consumer rights issue, but the consumer movement doesn't know that. They just, go in and say, we're going to do all this consumer friendly stuff. It doesn't work. The Carter presidency is a disaster, but he does start to deregulate, and then Reagan runs in there, gets rid of antitrust, concentrates capital, and continues to further deregulate. And the Democratic Party, their old suspicion of concentrated capital, suspicion of banks, suspicion of corporate power is gone, right? So this new generation is in, and they don't see power anymore. They don't see corporate power, and so they're trying all sorts of weird things. And then what I noticed is, as I was researching the book, is that at one day, basically a bunch of them went on Michael Milken's payroll, right? Michael Milken, the junk bond king. And so the chapter that I'm starting is, or the excerpt that you read is kind of like, it's kind of after the Milken has kind of corrupted the Democratic Party. It's after the new Democrats, the DLC, has sort of been formed out of that wreckage of the Reagan and Carter eras. And it's about how finance is really dominating, right? And then in the 80s, right, Michael Milken's making a lot of money. Silicon Valley is becoming this highly financialized place with housing shortages, and it's kind of a prelude to what it is now. Apple Computer just went public. Steve Jobs is one of the richest men in the country, and so you have, but he's like 28, right, as opposed to a few years ago, and so you have this dynamic where what do the Democrats do, right? And then in 92, finally the Democrats win and they get their chance, right? You've got 12 years of Reagan and Bush, who's basically similar to Reagan, and who's unleashed concentrated capital. He's unleashed merger wave, Wall Street. So what is this new Democrat, Bill Clinton, who ran a populist campaign?
Yeah, that's
right?
the thing. I didn't remember he ran a populist campaign that was the exact opposite of what he actually did.
That's right. And so he runs this populist campaign, putting people first. And then what does he do? He gets into office, and it turns out that he's just like a Watergate baby, right? He's like, I'm going to make friends with concentrated capital and pursue a model of social justice where you just let more monopolies form, and then you make sure that there's a meritocracy that is colorblind, that is gender blind, and you remove impediments to the free flow of capital, which can include unions, but basically getting away from the traditional protecting the engineer, protecting the farmer, protecting the shopkeeper, protecting the producer, and aligning with the financier, aligning with the monopolist, which is very similar. If you go back earlier in Goliath, there's this a very similar fight in 1932 when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was fighting the monopolists in the Democratic Party to see who could run against Hoover. And in that time, it was the populist who won. FDR was opposed to the bankers, but in '92, it was the kind of the neoliberal. The Al Smith was FDR's opponent in '32. The Al Smith of '92 was Bill Clinton, and he won. Al Smith was on the payroll of the DuPonts, right? So Bill Clinton wins, and what does he do? He unleashes this power. He signs NAFTA. He brings China creates the WTO. There's the Regal-Neal Banking Act, which just gets rid of interstate banking restrictions. There's a whole bunch of regulatory changes to deregulate media. Then there's the '96 Telecom Act, and there's a massive merger wave as well, kind of all across corporate America. And then he also encourages mergers in the defense industrial base. So today we are looking at the 737 MAX and its disaster. The reason that happened is because Bill Clinton encouraged the merger of Boeing, which was a great company, and McDonnell Douglas, which was not. And the McDonnell Douglas kind of financiers got control of Boeing and just started milking it for cash. And when you milk a company that has to make airplanes for cash, you ultimately compromise safety, which is what happened with the 737 MAX and then the 787 Dreamliner. But you're seeing all sorts of problems today that were a result of this concentration of power.
And Matt, I know firsthand that Boeing was a really good company. It's one of the first companies I ever worked for in the it was mid 80s. So just, before a lot of this stuff happened. So, I've been wondering too, what happened? That's not the company I know. So I definitely just want to, reaffirm that.
I think that's what's so important about the way that you're talking about this problem. And in Goliath, I go into this, and this is why the left is a little bit confused, right? It's that the Wright Patman believed, and Democrats going back, populist types going back on understood that it's not about being pro or anti-business. It's about how you do business. Because in America, how you do business is how you do justice, right? And so like Boeing was a company that was controlled by the engineers. And so they made amazing aircraft, right? And the aircraft was safe and it worked. They were improving the aircraft all the time. They did a remarkable stuff. And a lot of it was actually financed by government contracts. But we got the gift of flight out of that because we protected the engineer and the producer from the financier. And so that is a just way to do business, but it also is a good way to do business. And that's the way that the New Dealers structured our commercial and corporate commons. Now, there were problems. Like, obviously, there was corruption in Boeing on the defense side. There are always problems in every society. But you basically mitigate those problems with open and competitive markets and then regulated competition so that you protect the political power of the producer from the intermediary, like trying to manipulate them. What we did in the 90s is because the left, right, had completely forgotten about what business is, right? Instead of having a theory about we want to do business, but we want business to be done, we want to do business in a way that brings us towards justice, right? The left, kind of the consumer rights left, just said business is bad. We want to protect consumers. Because they kind of fell into that trap, they didn't notice that Bill Clinton was concentrating power in all of these dangerous ways. And then they didn't notice that George Bush was doing it, just like they didn't notice Reagan was doing it. And then when Obama took over, and this got to why I started writing the book, his entire all of his advisors and also all of the top leaders in Congress, they just had never been trained on how to understand what business meant, what finance meant politically. They just didn't know. And so when they came in, they were like, well, we need to concentrate power and turn that over to experts, which is what they had learned in the 70s, right? The way you solve problems is you concentrate wealth and power in the hands of technocrats, and then you have the technocrats, aka the scientists, the economists. The economists will tell us what to do. So that's why in 2009, when I was sitting there and I was like, I don't know much about finance, but it seems like wrong that we're foreclosing on all these people, right? Advisors and top Democrats would be like, oh, you're stupid. You don't know what you're talking about. The scientists have got this, right? We concentrated power in their hands, and the scientists, the economists tell us this is what we have to do, right? And it was a moral vision, right? It wasn't, that they were getting bribes. They really had a moral vision. It just was a moral vision that erased economic power from democracy and thus erased democracy itself.
And this is the ideology of the Chicago School, right?
Yeah, it's the tools of the Chicago School, but it's the ideology of the consumer rights movement, right? So the Chicago Schoolers, their view was we should concentrate power and wealth and then just let the capitalists do whatever they want with it. Because you know what, Mark Zuckerberg or Jamie Dimon or whoever, the reason that they are in charge of these big companies is because they're just good at it. So why would we want to mess with that, right? Now, the Obama people were a little different because they were like, well, we also need to make sure that there's some sort of social good here. So let's overlay some regulation on top of Jamie Dimon or on Mark Zuckerberg or whoever, and we'll kind of like our technocrats will work with kind of corporate leaders to make sure that there's some social good. And fundamentally, if you look at Obamacare or if you look at Dodd-Frank, both of the philosophy undergirding both of those pieces of legislation was to concentrate power and then regulate that concentrated power, a sort of regulated monopoly framework. We've had these debates before. I opened my book Goliath in 1910 when we were having these debates, and that's actually what Teddy Roosevelt thought. People think of Teddy Roosevelt as a trust buster, which is a total myth. He was not. He wanted to concentrate power and regulate it. He just wanted to concentrate power and regulate it in his hands. Woodrow Wilson was the guy that wanted to break up these concentrations of power, and that's what the election of 1912 was about.
Now, you say that this is that they genuinely have a moral belief in these things, but you also talk about this one guy, a lobbyist under Bill Clinton, where he says, "I gave up the idea of changing the world. I set out to get rich." So it wasn't just sort of a different worldview. There were a lot of opportunists in this too.
Well, that's true. I mean, I do kind of go back and forth, right? I guess the way I think about it is that, for a long time, people they just didn't know, or at least they weren't aware of the ideological superstructure, right? But at a certain point, even if you don't necessarily know that you're enthralled and you're entrapped into kind of the decisions that you really should notice that, foreclosing on millions of people is bad, right? So they should have noticed. They should have done a better job. I'm just trying to explain why they thought about the world the way that they did.
Yeah.
And then I also say, today, look, in 2007, if you didn't see what was coming, what was happening, I get it, right? A lot of us didn't know, but it's 2019. If today you don't understand that we have a serious monopoly crisis and a serious crisis of capitalism that we have to address, if you're just not willing to deal with that, which I think a lot of people, powerful people, are just not willing to deal with, I do think that is corruption. Once there is an alternative and you see that there can be an alternative and you just choose to avoid it, then yeah, I think that's when you kind of move into, then they're just protecting their interests. But I don't think it was that's a very expensive way to maintain a society, and I don't think that's what was maintaining it. And I think people really believed in this, in the neoliberal framework.
So the last few minutes that we have, and I do want to come back and revisit this after I finish the book, as I mentioned to you earlier, particularly about how they managed to completely change understanding of history and how this ideology formed. That in itself is something I think that's worth diving into. Obviously, you do too. You wrote a book on it.
I wrote it down.
Yeah, and but let's just
actually sometimes people ask me, they're like, "Hey, I know you wrote a book, but can you explain this thing in a non-book form?" And I'm like, "Dude, I wrote a book. It's there.
Yeah.
It's right. It's there. I wrote a book. I wrote it down. It's there."
If I could have done that, I would have done an article on it, not a book of 3 to 5 years of my life. Yeah. So let's just fast forward to today, and because everything that you're writing about here, not only can I frame it in terms of seeing how the empire evolved too, but what we just saw in 2016 was sort of a reckoning of it. Now we basically have we have a very weak left populist movement that could take us, maybe not exactly an FDR, but something like an FDR. And instead, you had this faux right populist, shocked the entire world and won an election because the Democrats have completely abandoned their real left populist stance. Right. So you have Bernie, who I guess would be the closest thing to an FDR, and obviously he didn't fall for that change in history that happened, that so many other people did in the 50s, because he seems to very clearly understand what happened, why the New Deal happened, and all that. But Trump was able to basically take advantage of this big hole that has been left in these two parties. So, I'll just leave it kind of wide open to see what your thoughts are on this whole political situation that we have today.
Yeah, I think that's right. the uh, the Democrats, um, they abandoned their working class base, and they, I think, were pretty corrupted from the 90s until the 2000 teens. Reed Hunt wrote a book on this called A Crisis Wasted. But I think you could look at how Obama reacted to the financial crisis and how Bill Clinton concentrated power in the 90s. And then before that, in the 1980s, how the Democrats kind of didn't see what Reagan was doing and didn't run against him on concentrated on the corruption of Michael Milken and concentrated finance. I think you saw the cost of that is the collapse in faith in democracy, right? And you see this is something that we saw in the 1920s. So I go into this. There's a very fascinating villainous figure that I talk about named Andrew Mellon, who sort of oversaw. He was the Secretary of Treasury in the 20s, and he oversaw this period of intense disillusionment when Woodrow Wilson had tried to bring what he called the new freedom, and it was a catastrophe and ended with the First World War, the U.S. involvement in that. And then the 1920s were this era where people had just lost faith in democracy itself. And I think that that's very much similar to what happened, although Obama is a very different figure than Woodrow Wilson, and he didn't have to deal with a world war. But Obama basically taught people that democracy is kind of a fool's errand. It doesn't really exist. It doesn't really work. And I think a lot of ways that Trump responded to that by saying, well, the system is rigged. I'm a gangster. I steal because that's what everyone does. And guess what? If you vote for me, I'm going to cut you in on the corruption, right? That was the gist of his pitch. And that's why none of the critiques of him worked, because they were all essentially, well, you're corrupt, and he's like, yeah, I am. The system is corrupt and I'm going to cut you in on the deal. And Democrats have a hard time reckoning with the fact that they did bad things. Right? That people don't trust them anymore. They still sort of think, oh, well, we're on the side of justice. And it's like, I mean, you have to prove that, and your track record doesn't suggest you are.
Well, it's a facade. I mean, once they realize that the neoliberal identity, and frankly, I'm not still sure if they quite understand this, but once they realize that everyone hates sees through and hates the neoliberal identity and what it has done, they have struggled to come up with any kind of identity since then. And that's why they can't get the working class voters anymore, why they struggle with that. I'm not so sure that Trump said he'd cut us in on it, because don't forget, he said he'd bring the jobs back, and he ran as an anti-corruption candidate, part of him. So, he just mixed it all up. He just took advantage of the situation. But he did try to change the Republican Party into the party of the working class voter, which I guess it had already been, but he tried to sort of reinforce that. But the Democrats are just lost.
I mean, he's a bullshit artist, right? So he told people kind of what they wanted to hear, and it was, a lot of it was racially coded. So it's like, look, basically he said, I mean, in one of the debates, they were like, you gave money to Bill Clinton. And he said, yeah, I mean, I bribed him, right? I bribed him to show up to my wedding. And that was it. That was the end of the discussion, because everybody was like, okay, well, I guess they showed up to his wedding. It was like he turned his corruption into a strength. And frankly, when you see what the Democrats did during the financial crisis, and you see the lobbyists, and you see the outsourcing, and you see the cost in human suffering of the snotty Ivy League, technocrats, it's hard to see a difference between that and kind of open corruption and sleaze, except that it's just less exhausting when someone's like, yeah, I'm just going to steal.
Well,
he's like, they're the same, but
he's like, I'm a billionaire and I can't be bought the way that I bought Bill Clinton,
Yeah.
And I'm going to bring the jobs back, but I'm going to do it, through, well, he did promise protectionism, but other than that, it was just kind of be some kind of magic that he was.
And he delivered protectionism. I mean, he followed through on that. I mean, it's not working, but yeah,
he's trying. He's trying. Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
So that's it's very weird. But
it's definitely very weird.
It's very weird, but also, Trump mirrors kind of like, what's this impeachment stuff about? It's not about any of the many things that Trump should be impeached for. It's like about protecting Hunter Biden, who's obviously shouldn't have been on the board of a Ukrainian oligarch's oil and gas company when his dad was leading Ukrainian foreign policy as vice president. It's like maybe there's not a direct pay to play there. There could be, but maybe there isn't. But it's still an obvious conflict of interest.
Yeah, it's all part of the bigger, we did domestic corporate rating, and then they changed over to international corporate rating, and that's what was going on in Ukraine. But I think the impeachment's over a different subject, but I think it's over more than just protecting the Biden.
Of course it is, but the point here is that your weakest possible framework
exactly
is to justify Hunter Biden's position, which he just shouldn't have been in. So that's all. I'm just like saying, when Trump makes a hypocritical criticism of the Democrats, there's almost always a grain of truth there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they've painted themselves into this corner, and as you said, like this transformation that sort of Bill Clinton put into overdrive in the 90s. That's what turned us into an oligarchy, or turned us back into an oligarchy. And the Democrats are captured by oligarchs. And so the populist talk, they can do the populist talk, but they can't implement the populist policies. And I guess they're maybe afraid of overpromising because the oligarchs who control that party won't let them. I think if Trump did anything, he pulled back the curtain a little bit. I think people maybe understand things a little bit better. That might be the one silver lining to it, other than I had hoped get us out of wars, but it looks like that's not going to happen either. So
anyway, well, there we go.
Yeah. Well, listen, let's come back to this and do a deeper dive into hopefully that aspect where you can explain how this transformation happened, or maybe there's another aspect of it that you want to deep dive on. But for now, let's leave it here. And I appreciate you coming on the show. It's great talking with you. And please let everybody know where they can find you, find your work, and how they can support your work.
Sure. So you can go to my website at mattstoller.com. Get my book, Goliath, The 100-Year War Between Monopoly Power and Democracy. It is a fun read, right? It is fun to read, and it is stuff that I uncovered that I never knew happened about who we are as a people and our heritage. And it's crazy, the kinds of things that have been hidden from us. So I very much encourage you to pick up a copy of that. I think you'll really like it. And then thanks for having me on.
Thank you, Matt.
All right. Bye.
Thank you for listening. Special thanks to Matt Stoller. Follow Matt on Twitter at Matthew Stoller. Find his work at Open Markets Institute and various publications, and buy his new book, Goliath, The 100-Year War Between Monopoly Power and Democracy. Around the Empire podcast is independent media. Your support, really important. Pitch in if you can. Patreon.com/AroundTheEmpire or PayPal.me/AroundTheEmpirePod. There are many ways to listen to this podcast. Find it on any mobile podcast app, or on the website AroundTheEmpire.com, Patreon, or on YouTube. And if you're listening on YouTube, don't forget to like, share, subscribe. Follow on Twitter at Around the Empire, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.